The stone arch of the village church was built for ordinary men. Logan could not fit inside. He stood at the threshold, his shoulders wider than the heavy oak frame itself. Behind him, the entire village held their breath in the freezing mud. They waited for the beast to draw his sword and burn their homes for the humiliation. The silence was absolute. Then, the soft bunch of footsteps cut through the terror. A woman walked directly toward the most dangerous man alive. She did not shrink away. She did not stare. She simply brushed past his dark armor and whispered 2 words. The cold wind swept through the valley, carrying the bitter scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Logan pulled his thick wool cloak tighter across his chest. He rode at the front of the column, his dark horse stepping carefully over the frozen ruts in the road. The village of Oakhaven appeared through the mist like a scattering of gray stones. He did not want to stop here. His men were exhausted, coughing in the damp air, and they needed a roof over their heads for the night. Logan raised a gloved hand, the arbor ground to a halt behind him, with a clatter of iron and leather. He dismounted heavily, his boots cracked the thin ice covering the mud puddles. Villagers peered out from behind their wooden shutters. Doors creaked open just an inch, revealing frightened eyes in the shadows. Logan ignored them and walked toward the center of the square. He was used to the fear. He stood nearly a full head and shoulders taller than the largest man in his guard. His bones were dense, his shoulders broad, and his presence took up too much space wherever he went. People did not see a king when they looked at him. They saw a weapon. The village elder hurried forward, his hands trembling as he bowed low to the ground. "We have little to offer, Your Grace," the old man said to the mud. "We only need shelter and dry wood," Logan replied. His voice was deep, scraping like stone against stone. The old man flinched at the sound. Logan sighed inwardly. He looked around the miserable square and spotted the village church. It was a sturdy stone building with a slate roof. It was the only structure large enough to hold his maps and his captains. He pointed toward it. "Clear the benches," Logan ordered his lieutenant. He walked across the square toward the heavy oak doors of the church. The villagers gathered at a safe distance, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. They whispered behind their hands. Logan reached the stone steps and climbed them. He stopped at the threshold. The doorway had been built centuries ago for ordinary men. The top of the stone arch reached only to his collarbone. His shoulders were wider than the wooden frame itself. He stood in front of the entrance, perfectly still. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the square. The wind seemed to stop howling. Every single villager stared at him. They stared at his massive frame, measuring the doorway against his chest. They were waiting for him to get angry, to yell, to break something. He felt the familiar heat of shame rise in the back of his neck. He was a king, yet he could not even walk through a simple door without becoming a spectacle. He turned his head slowly. Dozens of eyes dropped to the floor, but he could still feel their judgment. He closed his eyes for a second. "Tear the frame out," Logan told his men quietly. His soldiers hesitated. "Take down the stones," he repeated, louder this time. "Rebuild the doorway." The soldiers grabbed their tools and rushed past him. Logan stepped back into the freezing mud to give them room. He stood alone in the center of the square, an outcast among his own subjects. That was when he heard the splash of water. He turned his head. A few yards away, a woman was pulling a heavy wooden bucket from the village well. Her name was Diana. She wore a faded woolen dress that had been mended at the elbows. Her brown hair was tied back with a simple piece of twine. She hoisted the bucket onto the edge of the well. The water sloshed over the side, freezing instantly on the cobblestones. Logan watched her. He expected her to freeze, to drop the bucket, to join the crowd in their terrified staring. She did not. Diana picked up the bucket, the heavy wood straining her thin arms. She turned and began walking across the square. Her path took her directly toward him. Logan stiffened. Usually people crossed the street to avoid walking near him. Diana kept her eyes focused on her destination. She walked past his massive war horse without flinching. She stepped around a deep puddle and came within 3 feet of him. She did not look up in awe. She did not shrink away in horror. She simply walked past him as if he were an ordinary man standing in an ordinary square. Her elbow accidentally brushed against the cold metal of his gauntlet. "Pardon me," she said smoothly. Her voice was calm, holding no trace of the panic he heard from everyone else. She kept walking toward a small cottage near the bakery. Logan stared at her back. He could not remember the last time someone had touched him without trembling. The sound of hammers striking stone pulled his attention back to the church. His soldiers were knocking out the ancient bricks around the doorframe. Dust plumed into the cold air. Logan walked over to a wooden bench near the well and sat down. The wood groaned under his weight. He watched the dust settle on his dark armor. He rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. A shadow fell over him. He looked up. Diana was standing there. She had returned from her cottage without her bucket. She was holding a clean, dry piece of linen. Logan tensed, his hand instinctively resting on the pommel of his sword. Diana did not look at the sword. She looked directly into his eyes. Her eyes were the color of toasted hazelnuts. "Your armor is gathering frost, my lord," she said. She held out the cloth. Logan stared at the simple piece of fabric. "I have men who clean my armor," he said bluntly. "Your men look busy tearing down our church," Diana replied. There was no mockery in her tone. It was a simple statement of fact. Logan blinked. No one spoke to him so plainly. He reached out and took the linen from her hands. His massive, calloused fingers dwarfed her pale hands. He expected her to pull away quickly, but she withdrew her hands at a normal, unhurried pace. "Thank you," Logan muttered. "The doorway was always too narrow," Diana said. She looked at the church, where the soldiers were breaking the archway. "The old priest used to complain about it catching his robes," she added. Logan stopped wiping his breastplate. He looked at her, searching her face for pity. He found none. She was not trying to comfort a monster. She was simply making conversation. "It will be wider by nightfall," Logan said. "Good," Diana nodded. "Perhaps now they can bring the winter harvest carts inside without scratching the paint." She gathered her shawl tighter around her shoulders against the biting wind. "I must go help with the bread," she said. She offered a small, polite nod. She turned and walked back across the square toward the bakery. Logan sat on the groaning bench. He looked at the piece of linen in his hand. It smelled faintly of lavender and wood ash. He looked around the square again. The other villagers were still clustered in the corners, watching him like hawks. They were waiting for the beast to snap. Logan ignored them. He watched the heavy wooden door of the bakery swing shut behind Diana. For the first time in his life, he felt a strange warmth settle in his chest. He slowly wiped the frost from his steel plates. The hammers continued to strike the stone across the square. The narrow door was falling apart. Logan decided he liked this village. He folded the linen carefully and tucked it inside his heavy winter cloak. He stood up, ignoring the terrified gasps of the onlookers. He walked toward his soldiers to help them pull the heavy stones away. The sun dipped below the jagged hills. Oak havens sank into deep winter shadows. A single hearth fire burned inside the hollowed-out church. Logan sat at a heavy wooden table. Maps covered the scarred surface. He rubbed his tired eyes. The cold seeped through the stone floor. His stomach rumbled loudly. The army's rations had run low 3 days ago. Footsteps echoed in the entryway. The newly widened doorframe allowed the cold wind to blow freely into the room. A guard stepped inside. He announced that the village had brought their evening meal. Logan nodded without looking up from his maps. The guard stepped aside. Diana walked into the flickering light. She carried a heavy wooden tray. A ceramic bowl of stew sat next to a large loaf of dark bread. Steam rose from the hot food. Logan watched her approach. His soldiers usually left his meals at the edge of his table and hurried away. Diana walked directly to his side. She set the tray down carefully over a map of the northern valleys. "The baker sends his regards," Diana said. Logan looked at the bread. It was fresh and smelled of yeast and warm honey. He looked up at her face. The firelight cast soft shadows across her cheeks. She did not lower her gaze. "You are working late," she noted.
She wiped her hands on her coarse apron. "The maps will not change before morning," Logan replied. His voice echoed in the empty stone hall. Diana tilted her head. "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but a hot meal turns cold very quickly on stone." Logan reached for the bread. His large hand covered the entire loaf. He broke it in half. The crust crackled loudly in the quiet room. He offered a piece to her. He expected her to decline. It was not customary for a villager to share a table with a king. Diana took the bread. "Thank you," she said simply. She pulled a small wooden stool from the wall. She sat down near the hearth fire. Logan watched her sit. He ate the bread slowly. It was the best thing he had tasted in weeks. "Why did they send you?" he asked. Diana broke off a small piece of her bread. "The village elder drew straws," she answered. "No one wanted to enter the beast's den." Logan paused mid-bite. He appreciated her honesty. "And you lost?" he asked. "No," Diana said.
"I did not draw a straw." Logan frowned. "Why?" he asked. "Because you are a man, not a beast," Diana said. She looked at the heavy iron plates resting against the wall. "And armor is heavy." Logan stared at her. He set his bowl down. "People fear what they do not understand," he said. Diana chewed her bread thoughtfully. "People fear what is larger than them," she corrected. "It is a simple instinct." She pointed to the half-empty bowl. "You should finish the stew." Logan picked up his wooden spoon. The stew was thin, mostly root vegetables and a little salt. He ate it in silence. Diana watched the flames dance in the hearth. She did not seem anxious to leave. Her presence was strangely quiet. It did not demand anything from him. Logan shifted in his chair, wincing slightly. His left shoulder was stiff from an old arrow wound. The damp cold always made it ache. Diana noticed the movement. "The dampness settles in the bones," she said. She walked over to the hearth. She picked up a heavy iron poker. She pushed the burning logs closer together. The heat radiated outward. "Sit closer to the fire," she suggested. Logan hesitated. He was used to ignoring pain. "I am fine," he said. Diana gave him a steady look. "Stubbornness does not keep a man warm," she replied. Logan stood up slowly. He walked around the heavy table. He dragged his chair closer to the hearth. He sat down and felt the heat seep into his shoulder. The pain began to ease. He looked at Diana. She was still holding the iron poker. "Thank you," he said quietly. Diana placed the iron tool back on the stone hearth. "Do you have a family waiting for you?" Logan asked. The question surprised him. He rarely cared about the lives of the people he conquered. Diana shook her head. "My parents died of the winter fever when I was a child," she said. "I helped the baker for my keep." Her voice held no self-pity. It was merely a fact of her life. Logan looked at her mended sleeves. He noticed the red, raw skin on her knuckles from the cold water. He thought of the heavy bucket she had carried across the square earlier. She worked hard for a hard life, yet she sat here sharing bread with a stranger who commanded an army. "You could have asked me for coin," Logan said. "For bringing the meal, I mean." Diana looked at him in surprise. "I brought you food because you were hungry," she said. "Coin does not bake bread." Logan let out a short, rough laugh. It sounded like a bark in the empty church. The guards at the door shifted nervously. Diana did not flinch. She smiled. It was a small, genuine smile. "You have a terrible laugh," she observed quietly. Logan stopped laughing. He stared at her, unsure if he should be offended. Then, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I do not get much practice," he admitted. Diana stood up. She brushed the crumbs from her apron. "Then you should practice more," she said. She reached for the empty tray. Logan placed his hand on the wood to stop her. His fingers brushed against hers. Her skin was freezing. "Leave the tray," Logan said. "The guards will return it tomorrow." Diana hesitated. "The baker needs the bowl for the morning porridge," she explained. Logan pulled his hand back. "Take the bowl," he said. "Leave the tray." Diana nodded. She stacked the bowl on her arm. She turned to walk toward the door. Logan watched her figure retreat into the shadows. The newly cut stone around the doorframe looked raw and rough. The wind howled outside. "Diana," Logan called out. She stopped and turned around. "Yes?" she asked. Logan searched for the right words. He was a man of orders and tactics. He did not know how to speak to a woman who looked at him without fear.
Wear a thicker cloak tomorrow, he said gruffly. Diana smiled again. Good night, Logan, she said. She did not call him a king, she used his name. The heavy wooden door closed behind her. Logan sat alone in the quiet church. The hearth fire crackled. He looked down at the map of the northern valleys. He could not focus on the troop movements. He could only think of the scent of warm honey and yeast. He touched the edge of the wooden tray where her hands had been. Dawn drank over Oakhaven with a pale, lifeless light. The sky was the color of beaten iron. Logan was already awake. He never slept past the first light of morning. He sat on the edge of his cot in the church and strapped on his leather greaves. The air in the stone building was cold enough to see his breath. He stood up and fastened his sword belt around his waist. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the square. The snow crunched loudly beneath his heavy boots. A few sentries stood by the watchfires, their faces hidden behind thick wool scarves. Logan nodded to them and continued his patrol. He liked the quiet of the morning before the camp fully awakened. He walked past the armory tent and the supply wagons. The village seemed completely deserted. Then he heard the shouting. The harsh voice came from the alley beside the bakery. Logan stopped walking and turned his head. He moved silently toward the sound, his boots finding the softest patches of snow. He stopped behind a stack of chopped firewood. He peered around the edge of the timber. Diana stood in the alleyway. She held a heavy sack of flour in her arms. The baker, a red-faced man with a thick beard, stood over her. He was waving a wooden stirring spoon in the air. "You are slow, girl," the baker yelled. His voice bounced off the narrow stone walls. "The fire is dying, and the water buckets are still empty." Diana did not look away from him. "The well was frozen solid this morning," she explained calmly. "I had to melt the ice with boiling water first." The baker stepped closer, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. "I do not pay you for excuses," he shouted. He raised the wooden spoon and brought it down hard. The wood cracked against the back of Diana's hand. Logan felt a sudden violent surge of heat in his chest. His hand gripped the hilt of his sword so hard, his knuckles turned white. He took half a step forward from behind the firewood. He wanted to draw his blade and sever the baker's hand at the wrist. It would only take a single strike. But Diana did not cry out. She did not drop the heavy flour sack. She simply tightened her grip, her knuckles reddening where the spoon had struck. "I will fetch the water now," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. She turned around and carried the heavy sack into the bakery. The baker grumbled something under his breath and followed her inside. Logan stood frozen behind the wood pile. His heart beat heavily against his ribs. He forced his hand to release the sword hilt. He knew that if he intervened now, he would ruin her standing in the village. She had survived here long before his army arrived. He leaned back against the rough bark of the logs. He waited in the freezing shadows. A few minutes later, the back door of the bakery swung open. Diana stepped out into the snow. She was pulling a wooden handcart. 3 massive iron cauldrons sat in the cart, crusted with burnt porridge and ash. She gripped the wooden handles of the cart. She leaned forward, using her entire body weight to pull it through the snowdrifts. Logan watched her struggle down the narrow path that led toward the river. He followed her at a distance. He kept his footsteps light, mirroring her pace. The river was a ribbon of black water cutting through the white landscape. Bare willow trees lined the banks like crooked fingers. Diana dragged the cart to the edge of the water. She let go of the handles and rubbed her bare hands together. She knelt in the snow by the riverbank. The shallow water near the edge had frozen overnight. She picked up a large, smooth river stone. She brought it down hard against the surface of the ice. The ice cracked with a sharp snap. She hit it again until a small pool of dark water was exposed. She pulled the first iron cauldron from the cart and dragged it to the water's edge. She grabbed a handful of coarse sand from the bank. She plunged her bare hands into the freezing water. Logan felt a physical ache in his own chest. He stepped out from behind the willow trees. His boots snapped a dry twig on the ground. Diana turned her head sharply. She saw him standing there in his dark winter cloak. She paused, her hands still dripping with freezing water. "You are far from your maps, Logan," she said softly. She did not sound startled. Logan walked down the snowy bank. He stopped beside her. He looked down at the heavy iron pot and the coarse sand.
He looked at the red welt forming on the back of her hand. "The baker has a heavy hand," Logan said. His voice was dangerous, edged with barely contained fury. Diana looked at her hand as if she had forgotten the strike. "He is stressed," she replied. "An army eats a lot of bread." Logan frowned. "That does not give him the right to strike you." Diana went back to scrubbing the burnt porridge with the wet sand. "It is a small price for a roof and a warm hearth," she said. Her fingers were turning blue from the icy water. Logan unclasped his heavy winter cloak. He threw the dark wool over a nearby branch. He began to unbuckle his leather bracers. He pulled off his thick leather gauntlets and tossed them onto the snow. Diana stopped scrubbing and watched him. "What are you doing?" she asked. Logan knelt in the snow beside her. He reached out and took the coarse sand from her frozen fingers. "I am washing the pots," he said. He grabbed the edge of the heavy iron cauldron. He dragged it closer to himself with effortless strength. Diana stared at him in disbelief. "You are the king," she said. "Kings do not wash porridge pots in a frozen river." Logan plunged his large, scarred hands into the black water.
"Before I was a king, I was a soldier," he said. "Soldiers clean their own gear." He rubbed the sand forcefully against the burnt iron. His massive hands made quick work of the stubborn crust. Diana watched him work. She knelt there in the snow, her arms wrapped around herself. She looked at his forearms. His sleeves were pushed up to his elbows. Thick, pale scars crisscrossed his tanned skin. Some looked like sword cuts, others like burns. He noticed her looking. He did not hide his arms. He continued to scrub the iron pot. "They are ugly," Logan said quietly. "They are proof that you survived," Diana replied. Logan stopped scrubbing for a second. He looked at her sideways. Most women in the capital fainted or whispered when they saw his scars. Diana just looked at them with quiet understanding. He dipped the pot into the river to rinse away the sand. The iron looked completely clean. He lifted it out of the water and set it on the dry snow. He reached for the second pot. "You do not have to do this," Diana told him. Logan did not stop moving. "I know," he said. He dragged the second pot into the freezing water. They knelt side by side in the snow. The only sound was the harsh scraping of sand against iron and the rushing river. The cold bit into Logan's hands, but he ignored it. He focused on the rhythm of the work. He wanted to take the burden away from her, even if only for a morning. He finished the second pot and reached for the third. Diana reached out and placed her hand over his. Her small fingers barely covered his knuckles. Logan froze. He looked down at her hand. Her skin was cold, but the touch felt like a burning ember against his skin. "Your hands are turning red," she said softly. "I do not feel the cold," Logan lied. "Everyone feels the cold," Diana said. She gently pulled his hand away from the third pot. "You have done enough," she told him. Logan looked into her hazel eyes. He saw no fear, no submission, only quiet gratitude. He slowly pulled his hands out of the water. He stood up and wiped his wet hands on his pants. He grabbed the 2 clean pots and lifted them effortlessly into the cart. Diana washed the last pot quickly and rinsed it. Logan took it from her and placed it next to the others. He picked up his heavy cloak from the tree branch. He draped it over her narrow shoulders. The dark wool engulfed her completely. Diana looked up at him from inside the oversized collar. "I will get it dirty," she protested. "It is already dirty," Logan said. He walked to the front of the cart and grabbed the wooden handles. "I will pull," he ordered. Diana did not argue this time. She pulled the heavy cloak tighter around herself. It smelled of leather, pine, and wood smoke. They walked back toward the village in silence. Logan pulled the heavy cart as if it weighed nothing at all. He did not look back, but he knew she was following in his footsteps. He decided in that moment that he would not leave Oakhaven until the baker learned a lesson in respect. He would not use his sword, but he would make sure she never dragged these pots again. The village came into view through the falling snow. The smoke from the bakery chimney curled into the gray sky.
Logan felt a strange sense of purpose that had nothing to do with war. The wooden wheels of the cart rattled over the cobblestones. Logan stopped in front of the bakery. He left the heavy iron cauldrons by the door and pushed it open. A wave of intense heat washed over him. The smell of burnt flour and sweet yeast hung heavy in the air. The baker was standing by the large stone oven with a long wooden paddle. He turned around to shout at Diana for being late. The words died in his throat when he saw Logan filling the doorway. Logan stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He did not draw his sword or raise his voice. He simply walked toward the wooden counter. The floorboards groaned under his immense weight. The baker took a step back, his shoulders hitting the hot bricks of the oven. "My lord," the baker stammered. He dropped the wooden paddle onto the floor with a loud clatter. Logan reached inside his heavy winter cloak. He pulled out a thick leather pouch. He dropped it onto the flour-covered counter. The heavy impact made the wooden table shudder. The sound of gold coins clinking together filled the quiet room. "My men will require fresh bread every morning," Logan said. His voice was low, carrying a dark, unquestionable authority. "This will cover the cost of your flour, your firewood, and your time." The baker stared at the pouch, his eyes wide with greed and fear. There was enough gold in that bag to buy the entire village, twice over. "Yes, your grace," the baker said quickly.
"Whatever you need." Logan placed his large, scarred hand flat on the wooden counter. He leaned forward slightly. "I have one condition," Logan added softly. The baker swallowed hard. "Diana is your assistant, not your pack mule," Logan stated. "She will no longer carry water from the frozen river or haul iron cauldrons through the snow." The baker nodded frantically. "Of course, my lord," he said. "And if I ever see a bruise on her skin, or hear that you have raised a hand to her again," Logan continued. He let the sentence hang in the hot air for a moment. He looked directly into the baker's terrified eyes. "I will have my soldiers pin you to this floor, and I will personally crush both of your hands with a smithing hammer." Logan did not yell or threaten with anger. He spoke the words as a simple, undeniable promise of retribution. The baker turned ashen and gripped the edge of the oven for support. "I understand completely, my lord," he whispered. Logan stood straight. He turned around and walked out of the bakery without another word. Diana was waiting outside, shivering slightly in the cold wind. Logan looked down at the ground. He noticed her footprints in the fresh snow. The right footprint left a small, dark red stain behind. He looked at her feet. She was wearing worn leather boots that were completely falling apart. The soles were pulling away from the upper leather. Rags had been stuffed inside to keep the freezing wetness out, but they were already soaked. Logan felt a familiar, cold fury settle in his gut. He said nothing to her about it. He simply nodded to her and walked back toward the military camp. He found his quartermaster sitting near the supply wagons. "Bring me the thickest winter leather we have," Logan ordered, "and a cobbler's needle with waxed thread." The quartermaster hurried to obey without asking questions. Night fell over Oakhaven, bringing a bitter, howling wind. The guards stationed outside the church stamped their feet to stay warm. Inside, Logan sat by the large hearth fire. He was sharpening his hunting knife on a whetstone. The heavy oak doors creaked open. Diana walked in carrying a wooden tray. She set the tray on his map table. Logan sheathed his knife and stood up. He walked over to the table and looked at her. Her face was pale from the cold, but she looked rested. "The baker hired 2 boys from the village to fetch the wood and water today," she said quietly. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes searching his face. "He would not let me lift anything heavier than a loaf of bread." Logan crossed his arms over his broad chest. "He found his common sense," Logan replied. Diana shook her head slightly. "He found terror," she corrected him. She reached out and placed a warm bowl of soup in front of him. "Thank you," she added softly. Logan looked away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Sit down," he told her. He pointed to the wooden stool near the fire. Diana sat down and held her cold hands out toward the flames. Logan walked over to his cot and tucked up a bundle of dark leather. He brought it over to the hearth and sat in his heavy wooden chair. "Take off your boots," Logan said. Diana froze. She looked at him in confusion. "My boots?" she asked. "They are wet," "And they are bleeding," Logan stated plainly. Diana instinctively tucked her skirt under the edge of her stool. "They are fine," she lied. Logan did not argue. He simply extended his large hand and waited. Diana sighed. She knew better than to argue with a man who could command an entire army with a whisper. She reached down and unlaced the frayed leather cords. She pulled off her wet boots. Her wool socks were soaked through, and a small blister had burst on her heel. Logan took the ruined boots from her hands. He held them up to the firelight. The leather was brittle and thin, completely inadequate for a harsh winter. He set them on his lap. He unrolled dole of fresh, thick military leather. He picked up his sharp hunting knife. He measured the sole of her old boot against the new leather. He began to cut. Diana watched him in absolute silence. The only sounds in the church were the crackling fire and the slice of the blade through heavy hide. She watched his massive hands handle the small knife with surprising precision. These were hands that wielded heavy broadswords and dealt the lines of enemy armies. Now, they were meticulously shaping a piece of leather for a village girl. "You do not need to do this," Diana said quietly. "The village cobbler can fix them tomorrow." Logan pierced the leather with a thick iron awl. "The cobbler uses choop thread that rots in the snow," he said. He pushed a thick, waxed cord through the hole and pulled it tight. "This thread is sealed with beeswax." He tied a knot and moved to the next stitch. "It will not let the water in." Diana leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. She watched the firelight dance across his scarred face. His jaw was set in deep concentration. "Why are you doing this, Logan?" she asked. Her voice was barely above a whisper. Logan did not look up from the boot. "Your feet were bleeding," he answered simply. "I am a stranger," Diana pressed. "You owe me nothing." Logan stopped sewing for a brief moment. He looked up and met her gaze. "You did not stare at me when I stood in the doorway," he said. He pulled the thread tight again, securing the thick new sole to the old boot. "You shared your fire with me." He went back to his work. "I pay my debts." Diana smiled, a genuine and warm expression. "Fixing a shoe is a heavy payment for sharing a fire," she noted. Logan snorted quietly. "A king's fire is often cold," he said. He worked in comfortable silence for the next hour. He repaired the torn seams and reinforced the heels with extra layers of thick hide. He used the remaining leather to create a warm inner lining. When he was finished, he set the knife aside. He held the boots up to inspect his work. They were not beautiful, but they were impenetrable. He handed them back to her. Diana took the boots. The thick leather was warm from his hands and the nearby fire. She slipped her feet inside. The soft inner lining hugged her cold feet instantly. They felt heavy, solid, and completely dry. She stood up and took a few steps across the stone floor. The new thick soles made no sound. She turned around to face him. Her eyes were bright in the dim light. "They are perfect," she said. Logan nodded once. He picked up his whetstone and his knife. "Keep them dry when you can," he instructed. Diana walked back to the hearth. She stood very close to his chair. She reached out and rested her hand gently on his broad shoulder. Logan stopped moving. His muscles tensed beneath his tunic. He was acutely aware of her small hand resting against his old scars. "You are a good man, Logan," she said solidly. She removed her hand and walked quietly toward the newly rebuilt door. She pulled her shawl around her shoulders and stepped out into the winter night. Logan sat by the fire for a long time. He stared at the spot on his shoulder where her hand had been. He had been called a tyrant, a monster, and a conqueror. No one had ever called him a good man. He sheathed his knife slowly. He knew he would tear the world apart before he let anyone in this village hurt her again. The fire crackled, spitting a shower of orange sparks against the stone chimney. Logan leaned forward and rested his elbows on his knees. He looked at the empty wooden bowl she had left on the table. The soup had been rich and thick, clearly made with better ingredients than the day before. He realized she must have used the gold he gave the baker to secure better meat for his meal. He rubbed his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there. His lieutenant entered the church, carrying a stack of missives from the capital. The lieutenant hesitated near the door, sensing the heavy mood in the room. "Report," Logan commanded without turning around. "The southern pass is blocked by snow, sire," the lieutenant said. We cannot move the heavy wagon for at least a week. Logan nodded slowly. A week in Oakhaven meant a week of waiting. Normally, he hated being idle. Patience was not a virtue possessed by men who conquered kingdoms. But tonight, the thought of remaining in this snow-covered valley did not bother him. "Double the rations for the men," Logan ordered, "and ensure the villagers are paid fairly for every piece of firewood we take." The lieutenant looked surprised but saluted quickly. "As you command," the officer said before retreating into the cold night. Logan stood up and walked over to the tall arched windows. The glass was frosted over, obscuring the view of the village square. He wiped a clear circle on the pane with his thumb. He could see the smoke rising from the bakery chimney down the road. He thought about her hands, no longer red and raw from the icy river. He thought about the soft sound of her voice when she called his name. He had spent his entire life building walls around his mind and his territory. He had worn his terrifying reputation like a headless suit of armor. It kept enemies at bay and kept traitors terrified. Yet a girl with mended sleeves and quiet courage was walking past all his defenses without even trying. She did not use flattery. She did not use manipulation. She only used simple, unrelenting kindness. Logan turned away from the window. He walked back to his map table. He pushed the maps of enemy territories aside. He did not care about the southern pass or the northern valleys tonight. He sat down in the quiet church. He closed his eyes and listened to the howling wind outside. He knew that when the snow melted, he would have to march again. He was a sovereign, bound to a throne of iron and blood. But as the fire warmed the cold stone of the church, a dangerous thought took root in his mind. He did not want to leave her behind when the spring finally came. He wanted to build a world where she never had to wear patched leather or haul heavy water again. He opened his eyes and stared at the dying embers. The beast within him had finally found something worth protecting. He would burn the very heavens down before he let her face the winter alone again. The blizzard struck Oakhaven before noon the next day. Thick white sheets of snow erased the hills and buried the roads. Logan stood by the church window. His left shoulder throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The damp cold had finally settled deep into his old arrow wound. By evening, the ache turned into a sharp, burning pain. A heavy fever followed close behind. He sat on his narrow cot, shivering despite the thick wool blankets. His skin burned to the touch, yet his bones felt like solid ice. His lieutenant entered the church to deliver the evening report. Logan sent him away with a harsh bark. He did not want his men to see their king trembling. He had built his rule on unbreakable strength. Weakness was a luxury he could not afford. The church grew dark as the candles burned down. The hearth fire dwindled to a low, red glow. Logan lacked the energy to carry another log to the grate. He closed his eyes and leaned his head against the cold stone wall. His breathing became shallow and ragged. He drifted in and out of a restless sleep. The heavy oak doors creaked open. A sudden rush of freezing wind swept through the empty hall. Logan forced his eyes open and reached for his sword. His clumsy fingers fumbled against the leather scabbard. "Put the sword away, Logan." Diana closed the door and pushed the heavy iron bolt into place. She stood in the entryway covered in snow. Her new boots had kept her feet dry, but the rest of her was freezing. She carried a covered basket over her arm. Logan let his hand drop from the hilt of his weapon. "You should not be out in this storm," he rasped. His voice was weak, lacking its usual deep resonance. Diana ignored his reprimand. She walked across the stone floor toward the dying fire. She set her basket on the table and threw 3 heavy logs onto the embers. Sparks flew up the chimney and the flames roared back to life. Only then did she turn to look at him. She frowned. She crossed the room and stood beside his cot. "Your guard said you refused your evening meal," she stated. Logan closed his eyes. "I am not hungry," he muttered. Diana reached out and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Her cold skin felt like a blessing against his burning flesh. "You are burning up," she said softly. She did not pull her hand away. "It is just an old wound," Logan grumbled. He tried to sit up straighter, attempting to maintain his dignity. A sharp spike of pain shot through his shoulder, forcing him to lean back. He cursed quietly under his breath. Diana opened her basket. She pulled out a small iron kettle and a bundle of dried bark. "Willow bark," she explained. "It will break the fever and ease the pain." She walked to the hearth and set the kettle on the hot stones. Logan watched her move around his makeshift command post. She moved with a quiet, undeniable purpose. He realized he had zero power to order her away. Even if he had the strength, he did not want her to leave. "You walked through a blizzard for a fever," Logan said. "I walked through a blizzard because you are stubborn," Diana replied. She poured water from his drinking flask into the kettle. A smart man would have sent for the village healer. "I do not trust strangers with my lice," Logan answered honestly. Diana looked over her shoulder at him. "I am a stranger," she reminded him. Logan met her hazel eyes. "No," he said quietly. "You are not." The words hung in the warm air between them. Diana looked down at the kettle. A faint flush crept up her neck that had nothing to do with the fire. She waited until the water boiled before steeping the bark. She poured the dark, bitter liquid into a wooden cup. She brought it over to his cot. "Drink this," she ordered. Logan looked at the steaming cup. "It smells like wet dirt," he observed. "It tastes worse," Diana agreed. "Drink it anyway." Logan took the cup with his right hand. His hand shook slightly, spilling a few drops onto the blanket. Diana noticed the tremor. She did not offer pity. Instead, she reached out and supported the bottom of the cup with her fingers. She guided it to his lips. Logan drank the bitter tea. It tasted foul, but he swallowed every drop. Diana took the empty cup and set it on the floor. She pulled her stool close to his cot and sat down. "Now you need to rest," she told him. Logan felt the heavy pull of exhaustion dragging him down. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead. "If I sleep, the fire will die," he murmured. "I will tend the fire," Diana promised. Logan looked at her face in the dim light. She looked tired, her shoulders slumped slightly under her thick shawl, yet she sat there, a silent guardian in the middle of a raging storm. "Why do you care?" Logan asked. His voice was barely a whisper now. "Because you fixed my boots," Diana answered simply. Logan managed a weak, rough smile. "A cheap trade for my life," he whispered. Sometime past midnight, Logan opened his eyes again. The fever was burning at its peak. The shadows in the church seemed to stretch and twist like old enemies. He gasped for air, his chest heaving, a cool, damp cloth pressed against his forehead. "Hush," Diana whispered. She was leaning over him, her face bathed in the soft orange firelight. "The shadows are empty," she told him. Logan blinked, trying to focus on her hazel eyes. "I saw the battlefield," he confessed, his voice rough. "There is no battlefield here," Diana said calmly. She wiped his face with the cool cloth, erasing the cold sweat. "Only an old church and a dying fire." Logan reached up and caught her wrist. His grip was weak, lacking its usual crushing power. "I have done terrible things to build this kingdom," he breathed. He did not know why he was confessing his sins to a baker's assistant. He only knew he could not lie to her. "Terrible things leave terrible scars," Diana replied simply. She looked at the white marks on his exposed arms. "But the war is over, Logan. Men like me never leave the war," he said bitterly. Diana pulled her wrist gently from his grasp. She did not step away from the bed. Instead, she placed her hand flat against the center of his chest. She rested it right over his heavy, beating heart. "Then let the war stay outside these doors," she told him. "Tonight you are just a man." Her touch sent a strange, calming shockwave through his fevered body. The ghosts in the shadows retreated, the memories of blood and steel faded away. Logan stared at her for a long moment. "Stay," he requested softly. It was not a command, it was a plea. "I am not going anywhere," Diana promised. She sat back down on her stool. Logan closed his eyes again, pulling the blanket tight. For the first time since he put on his crown, he did not fight the darkness. He let the exhaustion take him completely. He knew the fire would not go out. Sometime before dawn, Logan shifted in his sleep. He muttered something incoherent, his brow furrowing in distress. His large hand reached out blindly across the mattress. Diana gently caught his hand in hers. His fingers instantly curled around hers, holding on tight. He stopped muttering. His breathing returned to a slow, peaceful rhythm. Diana did not pull her hand away. She sat carefully on the edge of the stool, letting him hold on. His hand was massive, heavy, and warm. It was a hand that ended lives, yet it held hers with absolute care. She leaned her head against the wooden post of his cot. She closed her eyes and listened to the wind. Morning came slowly, bringing a pale, muted light through the frosted windows.
The blizzard had finally passed. Logan opened his eyes. The fever had completely broken. The sharp agony in his shoulder had dulled back into a familiar, manageable ache. He felt a solid weight on his right hand. He looked down. Diana was fast asleep, her head resting near his arm on the edge of the bed. Her fingers were still loosely intertwined with his. Logan lay perfectly still. He did not want to wake her. He simply watched the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders. He felt a profound, quiet peace settle over his heart. He had survived assassins, wars, and famines. He had always fought alone. Looking at the exhausted woman sleeping beside him, he realized he never wanted to fight alone again. He slowly, carefully, untangled his fingers from hers. He sat up and pulled the heavy wool blanket off his own body. He draped it gently over Diana's sleeping form. She sighed in her sleep and pulled the warm fabric closer to her chin. Logan stood up and walked silently to the hearth. He added fresh wood to the glowing embers. He walked to the window and looked out at the buried village. The snow was nearly waist-deep in the square. The army would not be moving for a very long time. Logan smiled.
Diana woke to the smell of burning pine. She blinked against the bright morning light reflecting off the frosted windows. She was lying on the soft wool blanket next to the hearth. For a moment, she did not know where she was. Then she remembered the terrible fever, the bitter tea, and the heavy hand she had held in the dark. She sat up quickly. The thick wool blanket slipped from her shoulders. It was Logan's blanket. She looked over at the narrow cot. It was empty. Logan was sitting at his heavy wooden table. He was fully dressed in his dark tunic and leather trousers. He was reading a piece of parchment, looking completely healthy. The terrifying pallor of the fever had vanished from his face. Diana scrambled to her feet, smoothing her wrinkled apron. "I fell asleep," she said, her voice thick with embarrassment. Logan looked up from his parchment. He did not look angry. "You were tired," he replied simply. "I should have gone back to the bakery before dawn," Diana said. She quickly folded his blanket and set it neatly on the edge of the cot. "The snow is waist-deep," Logan told her. "You would not have made it across the square in the dark." He stood up and walked over to the hearth. He looked down at her. His sheer size always caught her slightly off guard, but she felt no fear. "Your fever is gone," she noted softly. "It broke before sunrise," Logan confirmed. "The willow bark worked." He reached out and gently touched the folded blanket. "Thank you, Diana." His voice was deep and steady again. Diana felt a sudden warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "You are welcome," she said. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I must go," she said. "The baker will be frantic with the snow blocking the doors." Logan nodded slowly. "Be careful where you step," he warned. Diana walked to the heavy oak doors. She unbolted them and pushed hard against the heavy wood. The bright glare of the snow-blind square hit her immediately. The village of Oakhaven was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. Soldiers were already outside with shovels, trying to clear paths between the tents. Diana stepped out into the freezing air. Her new leather boots sank deep into the snow, but her feet remained perfectly warm and dry. She trudged across the square, following the narrow trenches the soldiers had dug. The bakery looked like a mound of white powder. The front door was completely blocked by a massive drift. Diana sighed. She walked around to the back alley. The baker was standing by the back door, holding a small wooden shovel. He looked completely overwhelmed. "Look at this mess," the baker complained as she approached. "The wood pile is buried. The ovens are stone cold." He shoved the wooden shovel into Diana's hands. "Start digging," he ordered. He quickly remembered his promise to Logan and stepped back. Just clear a small path," he stammered. "I will fetch the boys to do the heavy lifting later." Diana did not wait for the boys. She gripped the handle of the shovel and plunged it into the snow. The wood was heavy and awkward in her hands. She threw the first scoop of snow aside. It fell back onto her boots. She took a deep breath and dug in again. The alley was quiet except for the scraping of her shovel. Suddenly, a heavy shadow fell over her. She stopped digging and turned around. Logan was standing there. He wore no heavy cloak today, only his dark leather tunic and thick bracers. The cold air did not seem to bother him at all. He reached out and closed his large hand over the handle of her shovel. "Let go," he said quietly. Diana looked at him in surprise. "I am almost halfway to the woodpile," she protested. "Let go, Diana," he repeated. His tone was gentle but left no room for debate. She released her grip. Logan tossed the small wooden shovel into the snowdrift. He turned around and whistled sharply. His lieutenant came jogging down the path. carrying a massive iron spade. The officer handed the heavy tool to his king without a word. "Go check the perimeter lines," Logan ordered his officer. "I can dough out the alley, sire," the lieutenant offered nervously. "I said go," Logan commanded. The lieutenant saluted and hurried away. Logan turned his attention back to the mountain of snow blocking the woodpile. He drove the heavy iron spade into the drift. He lifted a massive chunk of packed snow with effortless ease. He tossed it over the stone wall as if it weighed nothing. Diana stood by the doorway, her hands tucked inside her shawl. She watched the king of the realm dig a trench in a dirty alley. His broad shoulders flexed against the dock leather with every movement. He worked with the steady, brutal efficiency of a man who had dug trenches for war. Within 10 minutes, the path to the woodpile was completely clear. The baker peeked his head out the back door. His face turned a pale, sickly color when he saw who was clearing his snow. He shrank back inside the warm bakery, terrified to make a sound. Logan tossed the iron spade aside. He looked at the frozen pile of oak logs. They were too large to fit into the bakery ovens. He walked over to a heavy wooden chopping block. A rusty splitting axe was wedged into the wood. Logan pulled it free with one hand. He picked up a thick oak log and set it on the block. She swung the axe. The heavy iron split the frozen oak cleanly in half with a loud crack. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the alley. Across the street, a wooden shutter creaked open. A villager peered out, his eyes wide with shock. Another window opened a few houses down. Slowly, the people of Oakhaven realized what was happening. The ruthless conqueror who had occupied their village was chopping firewood. He was doing it for the quiet, orphaned girl who worked at the bakery. Logan ignored the staring eyes. He set another log on the block and brought the axe down again. Wood chips flew into the crisp morning air. Diana watched his rhythmic movements. She knew he was doing this to spare her the labor. He was using his terrifying reputation as a shield to protect her from her own difficult life. "You do not have to split the entire pile," Diana said softly. Logan did not break his rhythm. "The wood is green," he replied, splitting another log. "It needs to dry by the ovens before nightfall." He worked for another 20 minutes. A massive pile of perfectly split firewood now sat ready by the door. Logan buried the blade of the axe deep into the chopping block. He turned around and wiped a trace of sweat from his forehead. His chest rose and fell slowly. He walked back to where Diana was standing. "The path is clear," Logan told her. Diana looked at the huge pile of wood. "You have given the village enough gossip to last until spring," she warned him with a small smile. Logan glanced up at the windows. Several shutters snapped shut instantly. He looked back at her, unbothered. "Let them talk," he said. He stepped slightly closer to her. The scent of pine, fresh snow, and warm leather surrounded him. "I will not be eating in the church tonight," Logan told her. Diana tilted her head. "Where will you take your meal?" she asked. "My men are clearing a large pavilion tent near the edge of the square," he explained. "It has a proper iron stove." He looked down at her hands, which were safely tucked away from the cold. "You will bring my dinner there tonight," he instructed. Diana nodded. "I will tell the baker," she said. "And Diana?" Logan added softly. She looked up into his dark eyes. "You will not just bring the meal," he clarified. "You will bring a second plate." Diana went very still. "You will sit with me," Logan continued, "as my guest, not my servant." He did not ask it as a question. He stated it as a fact that had already been decided in his mind. Diana felt her heart skip a strange, sudden beat. She had shared his fire out of kindness. She had mended him out of pity for his suffering. But this was different. This was a king inviting a peasant into his personal space. "The villagers will talk even more," Diana whispered. Logan reached out. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then, he gently brushed a stray flake of snow from her hair. His massive fingers were incredibly light against her cold cheek. "I do not care about the villagers," Logan said. His voice was a low rumble meant only for her ears. "I only care that you do not get alone." He dropped his hand and stepped back. He gave her a single, respectful nod. "I will see you at sunset," he promised. He turned and walked back down the trench he had just dug. Diana stood by the doorway, watching his broad back disappear into the snowy street. The cold wind blew through the alley, but she did not feel it. She looked at the perfectly split firewood. She realized that the most dangerous man in the world was carefully, deliberately dismantling the harshness of her life, and she knew she was going to let him. The sky turned a bruised purple as the sun set behind the frozen hills. Diana stood in the small back room of the bakery. She washed her face and hands with warm water from a wooden basin. She took off her mended apron and folded it over a chair. She opened a small chest at the foot of her narrow bed. She pulled out her only good dress. It was made of plain dark blue wool. It had no embroidery, but the seams were solid and the fabric was clean. She brushed her brown hair and tied it back with a fresh strip of ribbon. She slipped her feet into the thick, warm leather boots Logan had made for her. She walked out into the main kitchen. The baker had prepared a large roasted hen and a heavy pot of spiced root vegetables. He had not spoken a single harsh word to her all day. He packed the hot food into a large covered basket. He handed it to her without meeting her eyes. Diana took the basket and walked out the back door. The evening air was sharp and biting. The snow crunched loudly beneath her boots. She walked through the cleared trenches toward the edge of the square. A large pavilion tent made of dark canvas stood near the frozen river. 2 tall guards stood at the entrance, holding heavy spears. They watched her approach in silence. When she reached the canvas flap, they did not cross their spears to block her. One of the guards reached out and pulled the heavy fabric aside. Diana stepped inside. A wave of intense, comfortable heat washed over her face. A large iron stove sat in the center of the tent, glowing a dull red. A sturdy wooden table was set near the heat, covered with a plain linen cloth. Logan stood near the stove. He was not wearing his heavy steel breastplate or his leather bracers. He wore a simple white linen shirt and dark trousers. Without his armor, he looked even more massive, his broad chest and thick arms filling the small space. He turned around when he heard the canvas drop behind her. His dark eyes locked onto hers instantly. He did not say anything for a long moment. He simply looked at her dark blue dress and the ribbon in her hair. Diana felt a sudden, strange flutter in her stomach. "You look warm," Logan said quietly. "The stove is very effective," Diana replied. Logan walked over and took the heavy basket from her hands. He set it on the wooden table. He pulled out a chair for her. Diana sat down. Logan unpacked the food and set the roasted hen between them. He poured 2 cups of hot, spiced wine from a metal jug. He sat down across from her. He did not call for servants or guards to carve the meat. He drew a small hunting knife and cut the hen himself. He placed the best portion on her wooden plate. "Eat," Logan told her. Diana picked up her iron fork. The food was rich and tender. They ate in comfortable silence for several minutes. The iron stove hissed and popped in the background. "The baker was very quiet today," Diana said. Logan took a slow drink of his wine. "Fear is a good teacher," he replied. "He is not a bad man," Diana offered gently. "He is just afraid of the winter." Logan set his cup down on the table. "A good man does not strike a woman because he is cold," he stated. His voice held no anger, only cold, absolute certainty. Diana looked down at her plate. "People in Oakhaven survive," she said. "They do not have the luxury of being kind." Logan leaned forward slightly. "And what is your excuse?" he asked. Diana looked up. "My excuse for what?" she asked. "For being kind," Logan clarified. "You have less than anyone in this village. You work the hardest and eat the least. Yet you shared your fire and your food with a monster." Diana set her fork down. She looked directly into his dark eyes. "You are not a monster, Logan," she said softly. Logan gave a short, bitter laugh. He rolled up the sleeves of his linen shirt. The thick, pale scars on his forearms caught the light from the stove. "I killed my first man when I was 14, Logan said. His voice was flat, devoid of any pride. He was a mercenary trying to steal my boots in a winter camp. I broke his neck with a rock." Diana listened without flinching. "I spent the next 10 years slaughtering anyone who stood between me and the throne," Logan continued. He looked at his own large hands. "These hands have burned villages. They have broken shields and ended bloodlines." He looked back up at her, waiting for the horror to appear in her hazel eyes. He wanted to show her the truth of what he was. He expected her to push her plate away and run back to the bakery. Diana did not move. She looked at the pale scars on his arms. "Why did you want the throne?" she asked.
Logan frowned, confused by the question. Power, he answered automatically. No, Diana said gently. Men who only want power do not fix ruined boots in the dark. Logan stared at her. They do not chop firewood for a baker's assistant, she added. Logan felt a strange tightness in his chest. He looked away from her penetrating gaze. The old king was weak, Logan said quietly. His lords starved the northern provinces to throw feasts in the capital. My people were dying of cold and disease. I took the throne so my soldiers would never freeze in their tents again. Diana nodded slowly. You did terrible things to stop a terrible suffering, she summarized. Yes, Logan agreed. And you carry the weight of those things every day, she noted. Logan did not answer. He just stared at the red glow of the iron stove. Diana reached across the small wooden table. She placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm now, no longer freezing from the river water. Logan froze. He slowly turned his head to look at her hand resting over his scars. You survived a winter camp, Diana told him. You did what you had to do. I will not judge you for refusing to die. Logan turned his hand over. He opened his massive palm and gently wrapped his fingers around hers. He held her hand carefully as if she were made of fragile glass. You are very strange, Diana, he whispered. Diana smiled. Because I am not afraid of you? She asked. Because you see things that are not there, he replied. I see exactly what is there, Diana said. They sat like that for a long time. The food on their plates grew cold, but neither of them cared. The heat from the stove wrapped around them like a heavy blanket. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen river. Inside the tent, the world was perfectly still. Logan gently rubbed them across the back of her knuckles. He felt the faint red mark where the baker had struck her with the spoon. The mark was fading, but the memory made his jaw tighten. The snow will melt in a few weeks, Logan said. His voice was low, vibrating in the quiet tent. The southern pass will open. My army will march back to the capital. Diana felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. She tried to gently pull her hand away. Logan tightened his grip just enough to keep her from pulling back. He did not hurt her, but he did not let her go. I am not leaving you here, Logan said. The words were absolute. Diana stopped pulling away. She looked up at his face in shock. I belong in Oakhaven, she whispered. You belong nowhere near that bakery, Logan corrected her. You will come with me to the capital. Diana felt her breath catch in her throat. As what? She asked nervously. A servant in your castle? Logan looked deeply offended by the question. No, he said fiercely. He leaned closer across the table. You will never serve another meal or scrub another pot for as long as you live. You will ride beside me. Diana shook her head slowly. Kings do not ride beside village girls, she reminded him. I am not a normal king, Logan stated. He raised his free hand and gently touched her cheek. His rough calluses dragged lightly against her soft skin. And you are not just a village girl. Diana closed her eyes at the touch. She leaned into his palm for a fraction of a second. The nobles will not accept it, she warned him quietly. The nobles will accept whatever I tell them to accept, Logan replied. His voice held the dangerous promise of a conqueror. Or I will find new nobles. Diana opened her eyes. She saw the fierce, unyielding protectiveness burning in his dark gaze. He was offering her the entire world on a silver platter. More importantly, he was offering her safety. She looked down at their joined hands. It is a long journey to the capital, she whispered. Logan smiled. It was a real, unguarded smile that transformed his scarred face entirely. We have plenty of thick cloaks, he promised. He poured her another cup of spiced wine. They spent the rest of the evening talking about the lands beyond the frozen hills. Diana realized she was no longer dreading the end of the winter. For the first time in her life, she was looking forward to the spring. The winter broke 2 weeks later. The heavy snow began to melt into dark, muddy streams. Oakhaven buzzed with the frantic energy of a departed army. Soldiers struck canvas tents and loaded the heavy supply wagons. Diana stood in the small back room of the bakery for the last time. She held a small wooden box containing her few personal items. A heavy knock sounded on the back door. Logan's lieutenant stood there holding a large bundle of dark fabric. The king sends this for the journey, the officer said politely. Diana took the bundle and thanked him. She unfolded the heavy garment on her narrow bed. It was a magnificent winter cloak lined with soft silver wolf fur. She wrapped it around her shoulders and fastened the iron clasp. The heavy material completely blocked the morning chill. She walked out onto the busy village square. A royal carriage constructed of dark wood and iron stood near the church. Logan was talking to a tall man wearing rich velvet robes. The man was an emissary sent from the capital earlier that morning. His name was Lord Vance. Vance looked entirely out of place in the muddy village. He pointed a gloved finger at the overloaded supply wagons. "We must leave the excess weight behind, sire," Vance insisted. Logan ignored the advice. He saw Diana walking across the square and stepped away from the noble. Logan met her halfway across the mud. He looked at the silver fur resting against her brown hair.
"It fits," he said simply. "It is too expensive," Diana replied, touching the soft collar. Logan shook his head. "Nothing is too expensive," he told her. He guided her toward the dark iron carriage. Lord Vance stepped directly into their path. He looked Diana up and down with obvious distaste. He saw her plain wool dress beneath the royal cloak. "Sire, the royal carriage is for blood relatives and high nobles only," Vance said. His voice was loud enough for the nearby soldiers to hear. "The baggage train has space for camp followers." A dead silence fell over the immediate area. The soldiers stopped loading the wagons and turned to watch the foolish lord. Diana felt her face burn with sudden humiliation. She took a half-step backward. Logan did not move. He did not shout or draw his sword. He simply turned his head and looked at Vance. His dark eyes were entirely devoid of emotion. "What did you call her?" Logan asked. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried clearly over the mud. Vance straightened his posture, trying to look brave. "Protocol dictates that commoners travel with the supply train, Your Grace," Vance stated. Logan took one slow step forward. He reached out and grabbed the front of Vance's velvet robes. He lifted the tall nobleman off the ground with a single arm. Vance gasped, his boots dangling inches above the mud. "She is not a commoner," Logan said. He pulled Vance closer until their faces were inches apart. "She is your future queen." Vance choked, his hands clawing uselessly at Logan's iron grip. "And you are no longer a lord of my court," Logan added calmly. He dropped the man backward into the freezing mud. Vance scrambled away, completely terrified and covered in filth. "Lieutenant!" Logan called out without looking away from the fallen man. The officer ran forward instantly. "Take his horse and his velvet coat," Logan ordered. "He can walk back to the capital behind the supply wag." And the soldiers immediately moved to strip the emissary of his horse. Logan turned his back on the sputtering man. He looked at Diana. The cold danger vanished from his face entirely. He extended his hand toward her. Diana looked at his scarred, calloused palm. She placed her hand in his. Logan easily lifted her up the high wooden steps of the carriage. The interior was lined with thick pelts and warm bronze braziers. It felt like a small, safe sanctuary. Logan climbed in behind her and closed the heavy door. The noise of the camp instantly faded away. He sat across from her. The carriage jerked forward as the massive horses began to pull. Diana looked out the small glass window. The baker was standing by his shop, watching the royal procession leave. He looked deeply relieved to see the army go. Oakhaven slowly disappeared behind a bend in the road. Diana leaned back against the soft leather seat. She felt a strange mix of sorrow and immense relief. "You did not have to ruin that man," she said quietly. "He will freeze without his coat." Logan stretched his long legs out in the cramped space. "He will learn to walk fast," he replied. Diana smiled slightly, despite herself. "You cannot throw every rude nobleman into the mud, Logan." Logan crossed his arms over his broad chest. "I have a very large army," he pointed out. "I can throw a great many men into the mud." Diana laughed softly. It was a clear, bright sound in the enclosed carriage. Logan watched her face. He liked the sound of her laugh. He wanted to hear it every day for the rest of his life. "The journey will take 3 weeks," Logan told her. "The road rough." "I have slept on a straw mattress for 10 years, Diana reminded him. "This carriage is practically a cloud." Logan reached across the narrow space between them. He took her hand again. He did not ask for permission this time. Diana did not pull away. She let her fingers rest against his rough scars. "When we reach the capital, things will be complicated," Logan said. "My council will demand explanations." "Let them demand," Diana answered. She looked into his dark eyes with absolute trust. "You are the king." Logan tightened his grip on her hand slightly. He realized she was not just accepting his protection, she was beginning to understand his world. She was not a fragile flower that needed to be hidden away. She was a survivor who knew how to weather the storm. He closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the wood. The carriage swayed as it had a deep rut in the road. Diana shifted closer to him. The silver fur of her cloak brushed against his knee. "Get some sleep," Logan told her softly. "I am not tired," Diana said. "Sleep anyway," he insisted. "You will not have to wake up at dawn to fetch water tomorrow. Or the day after that." Diana closed her eyes. The rhythm of the carriage wheels was strangely soothing. She realized she was leaving everything she had ever known, yet she did not feel afraid. She was traveling with the most dangerous man in the world, and she had never felt safer in her entire life. The convoy stopped at dusk near a dense pine forest. The soldiers quickly established a perimeter and lit the campfires. Logan stepped out of the carriage first. He turned and offered his hand to help Diana down the steep wooden steps. The evening air was sharp, but the silver wolf fur kept her completely warm. Logan led her toward a large canvas tent set up near the center of the camp. It was his personal command tent, guarded by 4 armored soldiers. "The men have prepared a hot meal," Logan said. He held the heavy canvas flap open for her. Diana stepped inside and saw a large iron brazier glowing with red coals. A thick rug covered the frozen ground. Logan walked to a long wooden table and poured 2 cups of water. He handed one to her. "Thank you," Diana said, taking the cup. She took a sip and watched him unbuckle his sword belt. He set the heavy weapon on a wooden chest. "The capital is entirely different from Oakhaven," Logan said suddenly. He leaned against the wooden poles supporting the tent. "People smile to your face and hold knives behind their backs." Diana set her cup down on the table. "I have dealt with unkind people before," she said. "The baker did not hide his knife," Logan pointed out. "The nobles hide everything." He walked over to the wooden chest and opened it. He pulled out a small, beautifully crafted iron dagger in a leather sheath. He brought it over to her. "Take this," Logan ordered. Diana looked at the small weapon. "I do not know how to use a knife," she admitted. "You will learn," Logan said. He gently pressed the leather sheath into her hands. "I will not always be standing directly beside you, but I want you to remember that my steel is always with you." Diana held the cold iron hilt. She looked up at his serious, scarred face. She understood what the gesture meant. He was giving her a piece of his own strength. "I will keep it close," Diana promised. Logan nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Good," he said. He walked back to the brazier and stirred the coals with an iron poker. The sparks flew up toward the smoke hole in the ceiling. Diana watched him. She felt the weight of the small dagger in her hand. It was a heavy, comforting reminder that she was no longer fighting the world alone. The royal convoy passed through the iron gates of the capital city. Stone towers loomed over the crowded streets like silent sentinels. Diana looked through the glass window of the carriage. The capital was a sprawling maze of tall buildings and rushing people. It was a world foreign to her quiet village life. Logan sat across from her. He watched her absorb the overwhelming sights of the city. "They will stare," Logan told her. Diana rested her hand over the hidden dagger beneath her silver cloak. "I am used to people staring," she replied. "They will stare at you for a different reason now," he corrected. The carriage stopped in the main courtyard of the royal palace. Marble columns reached up toward a gray, overcast sky. Guards in polished armor stood at attention along the grand staircase. Logan stepped out first and offered his hand. Diana took it and stepped down onto the smooth paving stones. The air smelled of roasting meat, heavy perfume, and cold stone. A group of senior ministers waited at the top of the stairs. They wore silk robes and heavy gold chains of office. Their eyes flicked toward Diana, calculating and sharp. Logan did not release her hand. He walked beside her, forcing his long strides to match her pace. The ministers bowed as Logan approached the grand entrance. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the High Chancellor said smoothly. The Chancellor's eyes lingered on Diana's plain wool dress beneath her rich cloak. "We did not expect you to return with a guest." Logan stopped walking. He looked down at the older man. "She is not a guest," Logan stated firmly. "Prepare the Great Hall." The Chancellor hesitated for a fraction of a second. "The council is already gathered there, sire," the man answered. Logan nodded and continued walking through the heavy brass doors. The interior of the palace was vast and echoing. Torches flickered against dark tapestries depicting ancient battles. Diana kept her spine straight and her chin up. She felt the hostile curiosity rolling off the courtiers lining the halls. They whispered behind painted fans and gloved hands. Logan squeezed her hand gently. "Let them whisper," he murmured. They reached the immense wooden doors of the great hall. Guards pushed the doors open with a heavy groan of hinges. Hundreds of nobles turned their heads to face the entrance. The silence in the room became sharp and heavy. At the far end of the hall sat the Iron Throne. It was a brutal, jagged chair, forged from the swords of defeated enemies. Logan walked down the central aisle. He kept Diana firmly at his side. The nobles parted like water before the prow of a warship. They bowed, but their eyes remained fixed on the village girl. Diana focused on the Iron Throne ahead of her. She remembered the frozen river and the heavy iron cauldrons. She drew strength from those harsh memories. She had survived the winter, and she would survive this room. They reached the raised dais at the end of the hall. Logan turned to face the gathered lords and ladies. "My lords," Logan began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The crowd grew quiet. "The Northern Rebellion is crushed, and the winter borders are secure." A murmur of approval rippled through the hall. Logan held up his hand, and the room instantly silenced again. "I have also secured the future of this throne," he announced. He looked at Diana. He drew her forward slightly so she stood in full view of the court. "This is Diana of Oakhaven," Logan said. The High Chancellor stepped forward from the front row of nobles. "Sire," the Chancellor interrupted cautiously, "the realm rejoices at your victory." The man bowed his head in a shallow show of respect. "But the council must advise you on matters of royal lineage." Logan rested his hand on the pommel of his sword. "You will advise me when I ask for advice," Logan said. The Chancellor swallowed hard but held his ground. "A king must wed a woman of noble blood to secure alliances," the older man pressed. "A commoner brings no armies and no lands to the crown." A low murmur of agreement passed through the gathered nobles. Diana felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She knew they were right according to the harsh laws of their world. Logan did not yell. He let the murmurs continue for a long moment. Then he drew his sword. The hiss of steel sliding from leather cut through the hall. The nobles gasped and took a collective step backward. Logan pointed the tip of the blade at the stone floor. "I conquered this kingdom with my own steel," Logan said. His voice was low, yet it reached every corner of the vast room. "I do not need to marry for armies. I already own them all." He looked at the High Chancellor. "Diana shared her fire with a stranger when she had nothing. She possesses more nobility in her hands than this hall possesses in its bloodlines." Logan sheathed his sword with a sharp snap. He turned to a servant standing frozen near the dais. "Bring a second chair," Logan ordered. The servant scrambled to obey. Within moments, a heavy wooden chair carved with the royal crest was placed on the dais. It sat right beside the Iron Throne. Logan looked out at the sea of terrified faces. "Diana is your queen," Logan declared. "Anyone who questions her right to sit beside me will answer to my blade." He did not wait for their approval. He turned to Diana and offered his hand. Diana looked at the heavy, dark chair. She took his hand and stepped onto the dais. She sat down. The wood was solid and firm beneath her. Logan sat on the Iron Throne beside her. The High Chancellor was the first to drop to his knees. One by one, the proud nobles of the capital bowed to the baker's assistant. Diana looked at the bowing crowd. She did not feel triumph over them. She only felt a profound sense of peace. The brutal world of Oakhaven was finally behind her. Later that evening, The heavy doors of the royal chambers closed. The roar of the celebratory feast was muted behind thick stone walls. A large fire crackled in the marble hearth. Diana took off her silver cloak and draped it over a chair. She walked over to the tall windows overlooking the city. The capital was lit by thousands of torches and lanterns. It looked like a sea of stars scattered across the dark earth. Logan walked up behind her. He wrapped his arms around her waist. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He sighed, a deep sound of exhaustion and relief. "The council will plot against me," Diana said quietly. She leaned back against his solid chest. "Let them plot," Logan replied. "They plot against me every day." He kissed the top of her hair. "They will learn to fear you, just as they fear me." Diana shook her head slightly. "I do not want them to fear me," she said. "I want them to respect you," Logan corrected himself. He turned her around to face him. He looked at her hazel eyes in the firelight. He traced the line of her jaw with his rough thumb. "You did not eat your dinner at the feast," Logan noted. "I was not hungry," Diana admitted. "The food was too rich and the music was too loud." Logan smiled softly. He walked over to a small silver tray on a side table. He picked up a piece of dark, rustic bread. He had ordered the palace kitchens to bake it exactly like the bread in Oakhaven. He broke it in half and handed a piece to her. Diana took the bread. She smelled the familiar scent of yeast and war honey. She looked at the most powerful man in the world standing in his royal chambers. He was still the same man who had washed iron pots in a freezing river. She took a bite of the bread. "It is perfect," she told him. Logan sat in a chair near the fire. He stretched his legs out toward the heat. "I hated this room," Logan confessed. He looked around the opulent chamber. It was always too large and too cold. Diana walked over and sat on the thick rug beside his chair. She rested her arm across his knee. "It is not cold tonight," she said. Logan looked down at her. He rested his large hand on her shoulder. He felt the steady rhythm of her breathing. He thought about the long years of war, the blood in the snow, and the endless betrayals. He had built his kingdom on violence because it was the only language he knew. Then a girl had handed him a piece of linen to wipe the frost from his armor. She had rewritten the language of his life with a single act of grace. "Diana," Logan whispered into the quiet room. She looked up at him. "I promised you would never haul water again," he said. "You have kept that promise," she replied. "I am making a new promise tonight," Logan continued. He leaned down closer to her. "I will spend the rest of my days making sure you never know the cold again." Diana smiled. She reached up and touched the pale scar on his cheek. "And I will make sure you never have to fight your ghosts alone," she promised in return. Logan closed his eyes. He leaned into her touch. The beast that had driven him to conquer the world finally went to sleep. He had won many battles in his harsh life, but sitting by the fire with Diana, he knew he had finally won his peace. The winter was over. Their story was just beginning.
You know, what really gets me about Logan and Diana is that true power isn't about making people fear you. It's about who you choose to protect when the doors are finally closed. If their journey warmed your heart, please hit subscribe. I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop your city in the comments, and while you're there, tell me, what kind of hero should we create next?